After what felt like hours but was actually only seconds, there came a sound Frank never thought he would be happy to hear, the unmistakable of the jetpack's flames sputtering out. A moment later, Frank slid to a stop. To his surprise, he was alive and relatively unscathed. The field behind him, however, had not been quite as lucky. As he turned around, his eyes grew wide. Patches of fire had sprouted up in his wake and were growing larger. Frank let out a shout and leapt to his feet. He ran and frantically stomped at the burning crops. By the time he reached the pail of water he had left, he had managed to put out most of the fires. But then he realized there was something else burning. Letting out another shout, Frank tore the jetpack off his back and threw it to the ground. He dumped the bucket of water over it. There was a sizzle as the flames went out. Pulling off his goggles, Frank looked down at his masterpiece, now a singed pile of metal. He let out a sigh. Not all inventions work the first go-around, he told himself. Einstein had tried hundreds of formulas before he came up with E=mc². Frank just needed to go back to the drawing board. Things would go smoother next time. Inside the barn, Frank sat on a workbench, repairing his jetpack. On the wall in front of him, a board had been covered with comic panels, sketches, and pages ripped from magazines. This was Frank's idea board. In the middle of it all was a brochure for the World's Fair happening then in Queens, New York. As the radio blared a Beach Boys tune through his homemade headphones, Frank smiled. This was what he loved to do more than anything in the world. Create. This was what he wanted to do with his life. Not plant crops and harvest them and then do it all again. If only his father could understand. A dark shadow suddenly washed over him. Frank looked up. His father stood in the open door of the barn, his arms crossed over his chest. Unlike his son, Pa was a man of the land. Always had been and always would be. That was why seeing Frank surrounded by odd gadgets and gizmos made Pa's hackles rise. "Ground's burnt out there," he said after Frank had pulled down his headphones. "Really?" Frank replied. "Weird." There was a pause as Pa stared at his son, his eyes drilling into the young boy. He knew Frank was playing dumb, just like he knew Frank wanted to do anything but farm. "It's getting warm," Pa finally said. "We need to start harvesting today." "Yeah," Frank replied. "That's, why I got up early." Pa raised an eyebrow and nodded at the jetpack. "I thought we talked about that." "You talked about it," Frank said defiantly. Then he looked at the ground. His father hated when he talked back. Pa narrowed his eyes. "What makes you think you're gonna make that thing fly?" Frank shrugged. "I'm optimistic?" "You're 10, Pa pointed out. "Carl Benz started engineering university when he was 10, Frank pointed out. When his father just looked at him blankly, he explained. He invented cars. Pa shook his head. "Henry Ford invented cars," he retorted. "Henry Ford produced cars," Frank said, correcting him. Instantly, he wished he hadn't said it. He had pushed too far. Sure enough, Pa's face grew red and his frown deepened. "You're wasting your time," Pa growled. Frank always backed down. Today, he wouldn't, even though he knew he was playing with fire. "I'm not," he shouted. "This contraption doesn't work," Pa shouted back. "It's not a contraption," Frank cried. "I can make it work." "No, you can't." Pa's words boomed through the barn, causing Frank to take a nervous step back. For a long moment, father and son just stood there, staring at each other, their chests heaving. And then Frank took a deep breath. "I'm not giving up," he said softly. Pa reacted instantly. With one swift sweep of his arm, he knocked everything off the workbench. Papers, tools, even pieces of the jetpack went flying. His face fire engine red, Pa turned and looked at his son. He had had this argument for the last time. Frank had to stop pretending he would be anything other than a farmer. That was what walkers did. They farmed. "You want to use your optimism?" Pa asked.